What's a story that you've heard that still gives you chills to this day? Before we start with the first story, please hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Story 1. My uncle is a firefighter. He always has horrific tales to tell. One still sticks with me. He was first on the scene of a car accident. A log fell off a big transport truck and hit the car following it. The log sheared off the top of the car. Inside was a mom, dad, and child in the back seat. The child was lying down and sleeping when the accident happened. He awoke to the crashing of the car, only to see his parents' lifeless bodies still in their seats with no heads. That child will never be the same. I was told this as though it was true, but for all I know, it could be a tale passed around firefighters. As some people pointed out, situations very similar to this one have occurred. He has told me other messed up things though, such as the misconception that bodies splatter when they leap from the window of a building. They actually bounce a little bit. Cannot unsee in my mind. Story 2. I worked as a vet tech a couple of years ago, and this man came in to put down his old dog. Standard euthanasia protocol was used. He had a basic history, asked if they want to be present, etc. As a coworker of mine asked if he wanted to be present, he responded with, yes, because I lost both of my boys last week and I wasn't there for them. And I'll be damned if I'm not there to send off my last living family member. Both of his boys, we later found out, died overseas. After hearing this, our whole staff went into our euthanasia room and just hugged this man and his dog several minutes past his dog moving on. Out of my years in the field, I've never heard such a heartbroken man lose his animal. Story 3. My grandfather's second wife was a sleepwalker, the kind that would get out of bed and do things like make a sandwich in the kitchen. My grandfather became used to it, and whenever he woke up in the middle of the night and she wasn't in bed beside him, he would find her and gently lead her back to bed without waking her up, just as he had been advised. But one night, he wakes up and she isn't lying in bed, but instead sitting on the edge of the bed, her back turned to him. He calls her name to ask what's wrong, but she doesn't answer, and he realizes she must be asleep. He can tell that she's doing something, holding something in her lap, but he can't see what it is. He sits up, looks over her shoulder, and sees what she's doing. Still in her sleep, loading his revolver. Story 4. When I was maybe 4 and my sister was almost 1, my parents had been divorced a few months and my mother was driving us from Las Vegas to Wichita to see our grandparents. At one gas station on the way, this man came up to the car and told my mother, "I hate to see a single mother traveling alone, and I notice we are headed in the same direction. Do you want me to follow you for a while to make sure you are safe?" She politely said, "No thanks," and drove off. At our next stop for gas, he again came up under the guise of checking on us. He had been following us since the last stop. While he was talking to my mother, his sport coat blew open, and I saw a gun tucked in his pants. After she again told the man we were fine, she left, and I told her what I saw. While she was driving, she wrote a note to give to the next gas station attendant saying who we were, where we were planning on spending the night, and that this creepy dude was following us and what he looked like. Could you please call the law in, I don't remember what town it was, and have him waiting at the hotel? When we got to the next stop, Mom raced in and handed the clerk the note and sped off with us. We got to the hotel, and the manager had the cops waiting in one room and gave us another room with a pizza and pop. The man showed up and asked if his wife and kids had checked in yet and what room they were in. The manager gave him the key to the one with the police in it. They questioned him and found out he was a convicted and also had a warrant out, so he was arrested. Story 5. When I was in 11th grade, my maths teacher went off on a tangent about everything happening for a reason and why it is always important to be kind. At first, I was only half listening. Then things got interesting. When he was a senior in university, he decided that in his last days, he would go around to students sitting alone in the cafeteria and strike up a conversation. He approached a girl sitting alone and asked if he could have lunch with her. She seemed hesitant at first, but then agreed. They struck up a conversation and ended up talking for a while. She eventually asked him, in a startled way, why he came and sat with her. He explained to her that it had become his goal to sit with people he didn't know. She told him that this wasn't the first time someone had randomly asked her to have lunch with them. Apparently, when she was in high school, she was very shy and unpopular and usually spent her lunch breaks in the library. Towards the end of the year, a group of popular girls asked her to have lunch with them. She was shocked and said no at first. They persisted, and she eventually agreed. They got in one of the girls' cars and drove off school property headed to a restaurant. As they were driving down the road, dozens of cop cars whizzed past them. She went to Columbine High School. It was April 20th, 1999. She escaped being in the library where the majority of the shootings took place because a group of girls decided to reach out to her. Story 6. I forgot the title, but there's this creepypasta of a man who stays at a hotel with the one rule that he cannot look into the unmarked locked room on the way to his own room. He looks through the keyhole and sees a woman sitting in the corner. He thinks about knocking, but decides to leave her alone. The next morning, his curiosity gets to him again, and he looks through the keyhole. However, this time all he could see was a distinct red color. He assumed the woman knew he was spying on her and covered the keyhole with red cloth. He later went to the receptionist and confronted her about the room. The receptionist explains a woman was murdered in that room, and many guests have reported seeing her ghost. She was white all over, except for her eyes. They were red. Story 7. My grandmother's entire life she had a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she would be walking down a long dark hallway, turn to the left, open a door, and see something terrible. She'd always wake up before seeing what it was. In her 40s, she, her husband, my dad, and my aunt were on vacation. They booked the hotel at the last minute, so they ended up having to get 2 rooms with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. My dad wakes up around 3 a.m. and can automatically tell something's not right. He calls out in the darkness, "Dad?" No response. He turns on the bedside light. "Dad?" he says, a little louder this time. Still no response. Getting worried, he slides out of bed and shakes his father. He doesn't wake up. My dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandma's room and started banging on the door. My grandma worriedly opens the door, and my dad shouts, "Something's wrong with Dad." He leads her down the hallway, a long hallway, to the last door on the left. My grandmother reaches the door, turns to the left, and sees her husband dead in bed. Heart attack. She never had the dream again. Story 8. Oh gosh, so many. My Oma, grandmother in German, grew up in a small town called Weislach, Germany during the Holocaust and World War II. She rarely talks about that period of her life, but when we ask, she would say things like, "Yeah, I had friends who just disappeared, but we were raised not to ask questions." However, the most horrific story I heard was when she told me she was playing by a railroad track near her home with some friends. At one point, a large freight train came by. She heard what she thought to be scratching and screaming, but not those of an animal because she had heard that many times before when the train had passed. This time it was different. So she ran home and asked her mom what that could have been or meant. She said that her mom just yelled at her to never ask questions like that again and to stay away from the tracks and talk to no one. Story 9. When I was in my early teens, my parents used to go out dancing and left me alone on Friday nights. We lived in a rustic, soporific house, surrounded only by a desolate sawmill and a defunct car garage. The closest neighbor was about a mile away. I used this opportunity to throw heavy metal albums in their fantastic stereo and play them at an enormous volume. One evening, I put in Metallica's and Justice for All and went to the restroom in a small corner in the house. Blackened was blaring in the distance, and it seemed as if the floor was shaking. I walked back into the living room and looked at the front door, and I could see the chain on the door pulsating in rapid rhythms. I remember thinking, the bass on this system is incredible. Then, during the middle of the song, the chain stopped moving. Story 10. I work as a nurse. While I was training to become a nurse, a group of my friends and I were having a discussion as to whether there is some sort of an afterlife. I stated that I didn't think so, and a few of my friends disagreed. My instructor looked at me and said, "Well, I used to be like you, but I have seen some strange things in the hospital that made me change my mind." She proceeded to tell us a story about a friend of hers, who was a nurse, whose daughter had terminal cancer. The daughter was in her late 30s. She had a husband and 2 small children. This was a devastating situation, and she was about to pass any day. She knew this and kept telling her friends and family how afraid she was of dying. Even though she would be surrounded by her family in her last hours, she knew that she would die alone. Her parents were taking turns spending the night with her in the hospital room along with her husband. It was her father's turn to go home for the evening and take care of the grandkids. She ended up dying that night, and her last words were, "I'm not afraid anymore. Dad is here with me." As nurses and other health professionals can attest, people have some strange last words that may or may not mean anything. After the body had been processed and taken to the morgue, the mother went home and found her husband dead on the couch. She anticipated having one funeral, and she now had to plan for two. It was really creepy. Also, there is a ghost in my hospital of a 10-year-old little girl who was the first child to die in my hospital. Many patients report seeing her in a white hospital gown. Several patients have been noted to yell, "Get that little girl out of here!" Story 11. My buddy told me once that his college friend and their friends were out driving around tripping on mushrooms one night when they saw a statue of a gargoyle in a field. They decided that it would be a good idea to put it in the back of their SUV as a souvenir. As they continued driving, the people in the back said that the gargoyle kept looking at them, and it looked hungry. They were freaking out at this point, so they swung by a fast food place and just threw food in the back compartment to appease it. They got home and went to bed. The next morning, when my buddy's friend went to drive to class, there was a child in the back of the SUV sleeping with empty fast food wrappers around him. Realizing they had kidnapped a child thinking it was a gargoyle, he turned himself in. When he did, the cops informed him that the kid was reported as being kidnapped 2 weeks ago. Too long. Didn't read stoners thought a kid was a gargoyle statue and kidnapped him away from the kidnapper. Story 12. There was a family who had a snake that wasn't eating. He had skipped his last few meals, which are weeks apart, and the family got worried. So they boxed the snake up and took him to the vet. The vet examined the snake and couldn't find any problems, so he began to ask the mother, "Does he stay in a cage of any sort?" The mom replied, "Yes, but we leave him out most of the time." The vet asked, "Where does he sleep?" The mom replied, "In my 10-year-old daughter's room. She's very affectionate with the snake." The vet asked, "Does he sleep coiled up or stretched out?" The mom said, "Stretched out." The vet responded timidly, "I don't know how to tell you this, but he was preparing to eat your daughter. He had been fasting and stretching out near your daughter to see if he was big enough to eat her." Story 13. When my uncle was 4, he visited his aunt's home for the summer. There were really no kids around that were his age, so he mainly just rode his bike around the neighborhood to amuse himself. One day he rode a little too far and got lost, but luckily a car pulled over and told him that it was okay, he would take him back to his aunt's house. So my uncle loaded his bike in the car and got in. The man started to drive, and my uncle, thinking it was one of his aunt's friends, asked no questions. It wasn't until they turned onto the highway that my uncle started to ask the man where they were going, that his aunt's house wasn't near the highway. The man didn't say anything to him and kept driving, until suddenly he pulled over to the side of the road and seemed to think really hard about something. He then turned the car around and dropped my uncle off at the entrance to the neighborhood. My uncle realized years later that this man had attempted to kidnap him and at the last minute changed his mind. Pretty chilling. Story 14. This isn't nearly as good as the others, but it happened to my mom when she was young. So, she was at work, my dad was at work as well. At some point, she had a feeling something was going on and instinctively called my dad. As he picked up, she realized she didn't have a reason to call him, but it seemed weird. To not embarrass herself, she just told him to come to her so they could have lunch together. Since my dad was out of his workplace, I think he was stopping outside for lunch. Anyway, he comes to her, they have lunch and go on with their day. In the evening, they both watch the news, and there's been an explosion. At the same time they were having lunch, at the same place my dad was before my mom called her. Story 15. Probably the story about the girl that got lost in the Odessa catacombs back in 2005. I can only imagine that grim realization that you are lost and alone in a giant series of tunnels. Eventually the battery on your phone gives out and you're in complete darkness feeling along the cold, damp walls. An eerie silence surrounds you, broken only by your footfalls and sobs. You have no company but your fears, regrets, and the question of how you came to this when only a few hours prior you were drunkenly partying with friends. One day bleeds into the next, and your calls into the darkness go unanswered. Your hope of rescue begins to wane. No one is listening to your prayers. You're parched, scared, hungry, tired, and you slowly realize that this is where you're going to die. You choke on every bit of your existence. You've gone through the anger, the denial, the bargaining. But now you're too tired, too dizzy, and your head won't stop throbbing. Eventually, you collapse from dehydration, and your body isn't found for another 2 years. Alright folks, that's a wrap. If you like more of this, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can also share your thoughts in the comment below. I'll see you in the next video.